So if you're a studio photographer and if you ever had any troubles autofocusing with your Sony cameras, such as the camera like the A7R3 or any of the Sony A7 cameras, this is the video for you. First, I'm going to show you which settings to change so you don't get this problem with your camera, and then I'm going to tell you guys why this problem happens with the Sony cameras. Alright, first thing you want to do is change from the video mode to photo mode because they will have different settings. Then you want to go to AF and MF modes, AF, MF, and then aperture, drive, and AF. And you want to change that to focus priority. Now it says it might make it louder, but from my experience I haven't really noticed anything. So first of all, the reason why this happens with your camera is a very dumb reason in my opinion. I don't know why by default Sony does this with their cameras, and with the older cameras you couldn't even like change this setting, like you were just stuck with it. That's why when I shot with the original A7, like if I'm shooting in a lowly dim lit like studio, like this camera sometimes can't even autofocus, like I have to use manual focus with this camera. And with the A7R3, like it's a really good camera, so it can autofocus even though it has this problem, but there are some scenarios where I pretty much cannot use continuous autofocus with this camera. So first of all, let me tell you guys why this happens. So I already made a video about this before, so if you want to get into more detail on why this happens, you can watch that video. So with the Sony cameras, what they do is that when you're getting the initial focus on the camera, it keeps the aperture wide open to get the most light as possible so you can focus with the camera. But if you're using continuous autofocus, it just shuts down the aperture after getting the initial focus, and then after that camera cannot focus anymore because the aperture is closed down. So this only really happens if you're shooting with the aperture closed down, like if you're shooting at f8 or f11 or something, then these cameras have a really hard time autofocusing. But the setting that we just changed on the camera pretty much overrides that and makes so that when you're focusing with the camera, it keeps the aperture wide open. Now, I don't really understand why Sony does this by default. Like for example, if I'm ever shooting with like my Canon 1D Mark II right here, this camera like focuses perfectly in a studio. And even though this camera is like almost 20 years old now, like this camera focuses way better than the A7R3 and the A7 cameras. Now if you have the A7III, that camera has a lot better autofocus than the A7R3. But the thing is that it's still not perfect when you're shooting at like f8 or f11. It still struggles a little bit. But the A7IV doesn't do that. So to demonstrate to you guys real quick, like if I'll open up the A7R3 right here. So let me take the lens hood off. And if we turn this camera on, so as we can see right here, as I'm changing the aperture opens and closes on the camera. So if I'm shooting at, let's say, f11, right? The aperture closes down right here. Closes down all the way here. And the camera is just not going to be able to autofocus at this point. So when you turn off the live view, it opens the aperture up. So that sounds great, right? If you're trying to autofocus with this camera, as you can see, it gets the initial focus and then closes the aperture down. So that's the problem with this camera. When you're using autofocus continuous, AFC, it gets the initial focus with the aperture open and then it closes it down. As we're demonstrating it right here, it opens it and it does that. It opens it, it closes the aperture down. If you use AFS, then you can get focus with it because it'll just get the focus and then it'll lock it on. But if you're using continuous autofocus, then the camera pretty much becomes unusable if you don't have good lighting in the studio. So if you're a studio photographer, this is a game changer for the A7IV cameras because, again, this camera, even though it's a very expensive, you know, one of Sony's best cameras, but if you're shooting in a studio, this camera becomes unusable in a lot of situations, and I pretty much only use it in AFS if I'm shooting in a studio. I never use continuous autofocus with this camera, which slows down my workflow, and like I end up getting a lot of shots autofocus because, you know, the model moves like a slightly bit or something, and then you miss the focus on the eye, which is very annoying. But the A7IV, honestly, I gotta say, I'm gonna be making like a comparison video soon, but this camera is like pretty much game changing when you're shooting inside of a studio because it just like there's like no like room for error with this camera. It just every single shot I have taken with this camera is in focus. Like it's insane. Like even if the model's like moving around, you know, they're smaller in the frame, it always gets the eye in focus, which is crazy because like these cameras could never do that. So it's pretty wild. But anyways guys, thanks for watching this video. Hope it was useful. And I'm making videos every single day about the A7 IV. As I'm learning more about this camera, I'm just educating you guys with it also. So if you have any questions about this camera, make sure to write it down in the comment section below. And I'll try to make a video about it if it's something that I can do. So anyways guys, thanks for watching this. And I'll see you guys in tomorrow's video. Goodbye.